The Taliban firing shots into the air to disperse crowds who had gathered in the heart of Kabul for an anti-Pakistan rally. The latest protest since the hardline movement swept to power last month. At least 70 people, mostly women, rallying outside the Pakistan embassy, holding banners and chanting against what they described as meddling by Islamabad, were part of that protest. Right, so the gunfire can actually be heard right there. Another indication that despite all its protestations to the contrary, the Taliban's more repressive crackdowns appear to have already begun. Reports also suggesting that the Taliban have arrested several journalists who were covering the Kabul protest. Srinivasan Jain joining us with the latest on that. Srinivasan, what else are we hearing? There have been a few of these protests in other cities as well, but now the crackdowns getting stronger?
These protests are quite significant because they come just a day after the fall of the Panjshir Valley, which was the last bastion, as we know, of anti-Taliban resistance, but was also a symbolic protest or a symbolic site for all those who may not be comfortable with the Taliban's takeover of their country. And in fact, Ahmad Masood, who's the leader of the Panjshir resistance, had shared a message on his Facebook page in which he called for a national day of uprising, asking Afghans to take to the streets and march against the takeover of Panjshir, particularly with the backing, as he alleged, of the Pakistani government and the Pakistani army. And it appears that at least in some pockets, some cities like Kabul and elsewhere, the people of Afghanistan have responded to that message and have come out onto the streets with these widespread protests. Remember, we also saw large gatherings like these on Afghanistan's Independence Day, which was just some time back, where we saw many people come out parading with the Afghanistan flag, which was seen as a way of challenging the flag of the Taliban, which is a flag of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as they call it. And that too led to some skirmishes between the Taliban and the protesters. That too saw firing. In fact, some people were killed in that firing, if you recall, including journalists were targeted. So we're seeing somewhat of an action replay of that, though this time one has to say that especially in Kabul, the protests are being led by women. And so in a sense, Ankita, these are not just protests simply about the fall of Panjshir and about, of course, the interference as the public of Afghanistan see it of Pakistan in their affairs, but also a way of constantly reminding the Taliban that they simply cannot have their writ as they had in the past, that groups of people, especially in urbanized and more westernized pockets like Kabul, will come out and demand their rights. And the presence of women is an indication of that these are women who are not just chanting slogans against Pakistan, but when you hear chants of Azadi, it's also making a wider point about demanding greater freedoms from the Taliban along the lines of what the Taliban had promised, but don't seem to be delivering.
What are we hearing about the crackdowns themselves, Srinivasan? Some reports now in the local media of journalists covering these protests also being arrested?
Well, I think what we are seeing is, and this is largely due to social media, is that there seems to be different reports of how this is playing out. The fact that many of these protest marches could actually take place and be filmed and be put on social media indicates that it's not a complete sweeping crackdown of the kind that may have been there earlier. But we are also hearing that particularly in areas which are guarded by overzealous Taliban militia, that there has been, as you just aired, instances of Taliban fighters firing in the air. There are reports of journalists having their cameras snatched or in some cases even arrested. There is video doing the rounds of women who've been corralled into the basement of a bank in Kabul to prevent them from getting out onto the streets. So obviously there does seem to be different ways in which the Taliban is responding to these constant challenges to their authority. Is it fair to say that it's a sweeping overall crackdown? No. But it is equally correct to say that the Taliban are simply allowing this? That's not the case either. The truth seems to be somewhere in between. But I think it will be something for the Taliban to take away, that it is not perhaps going to be business as usual like in the past. People are conscious of Pakistan's perceived role in the internal affairs of Afghanistan. The presence of the ISI chief would certainly have been a provocation for the people to come out onto the streets. The role of the Pakistan, in all likelihood, in helping the Taliban take over Panjshir, and also challenging, as I said, the Taliban's authority in terms of the diktats they're imposing on Afghans. And I think all of that is playing itself out in these protests that we're seeing on the streets of Kabul and elsewhere.
Srinivasan Jain, thanks so much for joining us with all of those details.